Cal and Vera figured it was all just small-time fun, no strings attached. He was a man who stole love in small doses, pocketing a smile here, sneaking away with a warm night there. He built walls around his heart so high no one could ever climb them. But he was about to learn a hard truth. Some walls are meant to be broken, and some debts always come due. The autumn of 1883 was painting Willow Creek, Kansas, in shades of fire and rust. Saturday night meant one thing: a barn dance at the Holliver Ranch. The whole town was there, gathered under lanterns that swayed like captured stars in the prairie wind. Fiddles screamed a familiar tune, and boots stomped on sawdust floors worn smooth by 1,000 weekends just like this one. Kalan Vera leaned against the cider barrel, his hat tilted just so. He watched the dancers with a cool eye, the way a man does when he's sure he has no stake in the game. At 28, he was the best horsebreaker in 3 counties. His lean frame and sun-darkened hands told a story of hard, honest work under an unforgiving sky. But tonight, like every Saturday for the past 6 months, his eyes weren't on the crowd. They were on her. Iselin Weiler moved like prairie grass in a summer wind. Her chestnut hair caught the lantern light every time she spun, and when she laughed at something her partner said, Kalan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. A feeling he refused to give a name. She was wearing the blue calico dress. He'd seen her mending it by her window last Thursday when he'd ridden past her boarding house. The sight of her, tongue just peeking between her lips in concentration, had made him pull his horse to a stop. He'd watched her for longer than a sensible man should. You planning to stare a hole through that poor girl, or are you going to ask her to dance? Callan turned. It was Drex Oliver, owner of the ranch, holding 2 cups of spiced cider. His gray mustache twitched with a knowing grin. Don't know what you're talking about, Callan said, taking a cup. The cider burned warm down his throat, a small comfort against the October chills seeping through the barn walls. Sure you don't, Drex chuckled. That's why you've been nursing that same cup for an hour, watching Miss Vaylor like a hawk watches a field mouse. Before Callan could think of a denial, the music stopped. The dancers broke apart, fanning themselves, reaching for drinks. Iselin's partner, young Tommy Patterson, bowed and headed for his mother's refreshment table. For a second, Iselin stood alone near the center of the floor, and then her eyes found his. Across 20 feet of sawdust and scattered straw, he saw it, an urgency in her dark eyes, flickering like a candle flame in a draft. She glanced around the crowded barn, her fingers whirring a blue ribbon tied around her wrist, the same ribbon he'd bought at Patterson's Mercantile 3 weeks back, claiming he needed it for a bridal. She took a step toward him, then another. Her voice was barely a whisper over the chatter. I need to speak with you. Evening, Miss Vaylor, he said, touching the brim of his hat with practiced cool, the same gesture he'd use for any respectable lady in town. Fine dancing tonight. Please. The word came out sharp, drawing a curious look from Mrs. Patterson nearby. Iselin lowered her voice, a desperate edge to it. I need to talk to you. Really talk. Kalan's jaw tightened. This was it, the conversation he'd been avoiding for months. This was the kind of talk that led to complications, to feelings, to promises a man like him couldn't keep. Around them, families were loading children into wagons. Young couples were stealing moments in the barn shadows. Nothing that can't wait, I'm sure, he said, his tone light but his eyes holding a warning. This ain't the place for a private conversation. Then where? The raw need in her voice made him glance around again, checking to see who was listening. He set his empty cup on a barrel. He adjusted the familiar weight of his hat, a small ritual that always settled his nerves before breaking a wild horse. And right now his nerves were screaming. Same place, same time, he said, his voice low. You know where. A flicker of relief crossed her face, but it was followed by something else. Disappointment. The unspoken arrangement hung between them. Tomorrow night, Sunday, like always. For 6 months, they'd met at the old oak grove by Willow Creek, hidden from the prying eyes of the town. What happened there was their business, and their business only. That's what he told himself. That's the lie he lived by. Miss Vaylor, Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the moment. There you are, dear. The Widow Marsh was asking after you. Iselin's shoulders stiffened, but she turned with a polite smile. Of course, Mrs. Patterson. She gave Kalan one last look, her eyes full of words he refused to understand. Then she was gone, swallowed by the crowd. He was left alone by the cider barrel, with Drex Oliver's knowing gaze burning a hole in his side. Same place, same time, Drex repeated quietly, his voice laced with amusement. Sounds mighty regular for something that ain't nothing. Kalan straightened up, fixing his friend with a hard stare. Mind your own business, Drex. Fair enough, Drex said, raising his hands. Just seems to me a man who claims not to care wouldn't know a woman's schedule so well he could recite it in his sleep. The words hit their mark, because he did know her schedule. He knew everything. He knew she taught the little ones their letters Monday through Wednesday. He knew she spent Thursdays mending for the ladies in town. He knew she sat 3 pews from the front at church every Sunday, right next to the widow who'd taken her in when she arrived in town with nothing but a single bag and a letter from a cousin back east. He knew things a man who didn't care had no business knowing. He knew she waited for him every Sunday night by the creek, her hair loose around her shoulders, the way she never wore it in town. He knew the sound of her laugh. He knew the feel of her in his arms when the talking stopped. But knowing wasn't caring. It couldn't be. Evening, Drex, Kalan said, turning for the door. Thanks for the hospitality. Kalan. Drex's voice stopped him at the threshold. Sometimes a man runs so hard from what he's afraid of, he runs right past what he needs. The words echoed in his head as he rode away from the light and the music, out into the cool October night. He tried to think of practical things, the new colt that needed breaking, the fence line that needed mending before the first snow. Anything but her. But his mind kept drifting back to brown eyes and a blue ribbon. Back to the tremble in her voice when she'd said his name. She looked at him like he was more than just the man she met by the creek. She looked at him like he mattered. And that was the kind of thinking that got a man broken. Callan Vera had learned that lesson the hard way. He wasn't fool enough to learn it again. What he had with Iselin was simple, clean, no complications. At least that's what he told himself as he settled in for another restless night, counting the hours until Sunday. Counting the hours until he could see her again and pretend that wanting wasn't the same as needing, and that needing wasn't the same as love. The truth was waiting for him, coiled like a snake in the shadows, and it was about to strike. Sunday dawned crisp and clear, the sky a vast empty blue. Callan worked a 2-year-old mare in the round pen, his hands gentle, his voice quiet. The work demanded focus. A horse could sense a distracted mind, and a careless moment meant broken bones. But even as he worked, his thoughts were miles away, down by the creek. He could already hear her voice. Women who wanted to really talk only ever wanted one thing, to complicate a life that was finally simple. By the time the sun began to bleed across the western sky, he had worked himself into a state of pure irritation. He washed up, pulled on a fresh shirt, and saddled his horse. The ride to town took him past the Patterson place. Lamplight glowed in the windows. It was a picture of a normal family, safe and settled. The sight stirred a hollow ache in his chest, a recognition of everything he'd chosen to live without. He found his friend Emsley Corrick at the Silver Dollar Saloon, nursing a whiskey. Emsley was foreman on the Holliver spread, and the closest thing Callan had to a friend. They'd arrived in Willow Creek 5 years ago, 2 young men with more pride than sense. Emsley's weathered eyes missed nothing. "You're looking mighty grim for a man on his way to a pleasant evening," Emsley observed as Callan sat down and ordered a whiskey. "Don't know what you mean." The liquor burned, but it didn't touch the tension coiled in his gut. "Sure you don't," Emsley said with a knowing smile. "Same way you don't know you've been checking that pocket watch every 10 minutes since you walked in." Callan's hand instinctively went to his vest pocket. He hadn't even realized he was doing it, but Emsley saw everything. It's what made him a good foreman and a damn uncomfortable friend. "Maybe I got somewhere to be," Callan said. "Maybe you do," Emsley finished his drink. "Question is, are you going because you want to, or because you're afraid of what happens if you don't?" The question was a punch to the gut. He'd been asking himself the same thing for weeks. When did their Sunday meeting stop being convenient and start being necessary? When had he started planning his whole week around those few stolen hours? It ain't complicated, he said, more to himself than to Emsley. We're both adults. No feelings getting tangled up in it. No feelings, Emsley repeated, his tone carefully neutral. Then why do you call her darling when you think nobody's listening? Why do you spend good money on ribbons just to see her smile? The accusations hit him like buckshot. Callan's jaw tightened. Any decent man would do as much for a lady. Maybe, Emsley said, not backing down, but not every man knows exactly what time she finishes teaching on a Wednesday. Not every man makes sure to ride past the schoolhouse right then just to tip his hat. You've been watching me? Kalen's voice was sharp. I got interest in my friend making a damn fool of himself over a woman he claims not to care about. Emsley leaned closer, his voice low and intense. And I got interest in seeing that woman treated with respect, instead of being kept like some dirty secret. The words lit a fire in Kalon's chest. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly on the floorboards. You think I ain't learned my lesson? He growled, the words hard and bitter, torn from a place of old pain. You think I'm green enough to make the same mistakes twice? What mistakes? Emsley's eyes sharpened. This was new territory, a door Callan had always kept locked. Callan's hand tightened around his glass. The saloon suddenly felt too small, too hot. He needed air. Come on, he said, throwing coins on the bar and heading for the door. Emsley followed, just as he knew he would. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. Callan leaned against the hitching rail, the ghosts of his past finally breaking free. Missouri, he began, his voice rough. Her name was Clara. Promised she'd wait for me. I was on a 3-month cattle drive. Came home with enough money saved for a proper wedding dress. And what do I find? She's wearing a wedding dress all right, but she's at the church marrying her cousin. Seems he had a steadier job. Emsley said nothing, just listened. Then there was Ferrona down in Texas. Left me for a land baron twice her age. Said she was tired of living on love when she could have a real house and servants. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Can't say I blame her. Just wish she'd told me before I made plans that included her. The memories were a poison he'd held inside for too long. But the worst was Zeralda, up in Nebraska. His voice dropped to a whisper. Pretty little thing, sweet smile, made a man feel like he was the only one in the world. After a couple months, she comes to me crying, says she's carrying my child. He paused, the old shame still sharp as glass. I did right by her, married her proper, bought a little spread, spent every cent I had making it a home, getting ready for the baby. He fell silent for a long moment. The baby came early, he finally said, his voice hollow. Too early. And when it arrived, anyone with eyes could see it wasn't mine. Wrong color hair, wrong everything. Turns out Miss Zeralda had been entertaining other visitors. She just picked the man most likely to do the right thing. What happened? Emsley's voice was quiet. What do you think happened? The truth came out and she took up with the fella who ran the feed store. Left me with a cabin full of baby clothes and a reputation as the town fool. The man who couldn't even tell his own child from another's. The confession hung in the cold night air. He'd never spoken these words to another living soul. But East Celine's need to really talk had unlocked something he'd kept buried for a reason. So yeah, Emsley, I learned my lesson, he said, turning to face his friend. I learned love is just a word for stupid. Promises are just pretty lies. What I got with Miss Vaylor is honest. No promises, no expectations, no heartbreak when it ends. Emsley studied him for a long moment. Sounds to me like you've been in love more times than you care to admit, Cal, he said gently. Maybe the trouble ain't love itself. Maybe it's just you, too scared to call it by its name. The words hit Callan like a fist. He'd expected judgment, maybe pity. He hadn't expected understanding. And understanding was the most dangerous thing of all. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but the words had no force. Don't I? Emsley swung into his saddle. I know you've been different these past 6 months. Lighter, like you're carrying less weight. And I know you're standing here talking about the past when you got somewhere important to be. He looked down at Callan, his expression serious. The question is, are you brave enough to admit what that place and that woman really mean to you? Without waiting for an answer, Emsley tipped his hat and rode off into the darkness. He left Callan alone with a truth he'd spent years trying to outrun. He was in love with Iseline Weiler, and it terrified him more than any wild horse ever could. The ride to the creek felt longer than usual. His horse seemed to sense his mood, his reluctance. Twice he almost turned back. Twice some invisible force pulled him forward. By the time he reached the oak grove, the moon was high, casting long skeletal shadows. She was waiting. She sat on their fallen log, a shawl wrapped tight against the chill, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. In the moonlight, she looked impossibly beautiful, and so vulnerable it made his chest ache. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said as he dismounted. "Said I would, didn't I?" The words came out gruffer than he intended, raw from the confessions he'd made to Emsley. Saying and doing aren't always the same thing. Not with you. The accusation stung because it was true. How many times had he promised to meet her at a social, only to stay away? How many times had he avoided her in town, afraid someone might see them, might ask questions? "I'm here now," he said, sitting beside her on the log, leaving a careful distance between them. "Yes." Her voice was a whisper. "You're here. But for how long?" The question hung in the air, impossible to answer. He said the first thing that came to mind, a foolish, reckless thing. "Long as you want me to be." It sounded too much like a promise, the very thing he'd sworn to avoid. She turned to face him, and he could see the moonlight glinting on the tears in her eyes. "What if I said I wanted you here always?" Her voice trembled. "What if I said I was tired of secret meetings and stolen moments? What if I said I loved you, Callan Vera, and I wanted the whole world to know it?" The words hit him like bullets. Love. The word he'd run from his whole life. The trap he'd sworn never to fall into again. All the old wounds tore open, fresh and bleeding, his hands clenched into fists. "Then I'd say you were asking for something I can't give," he said, his voice flat and cold. "And we'd both be better off if you stopped asking." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the creek and the distant cry of a nightbird. He could feel her pulling away from him, though neither of them moved. "I see," she said at last. "And what exactly can you give, Callan? What are we doing out here every Sunday if you don't feel anything?" "We're enjoying each other's company," he said, the words sounding hollow and cheap even to his own ears. "Two adults. No harm in that." "What I have to offer," she repeated his earlier thoughts, her voice bitter. "And what exactly is that in your estimation?" The question was a minefield, but the confrontation with Emsley had stripped away his caution, leaving him raw and dangerous. "You're a beautiful woman, Iseline. Smart, funny, good company." He stood abruptly, needing to move. "Why can't that be enough? Why does everything have to have a name? A promise?" She stood too, facing him, her chin high, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because I'm not a horse you can break to saddle, Callan Vera. I am not some pretty thing you can enjoy when it suits you and ignore when it doesn't. I have feelings, I have dreams. I have a heart that I gave to a man who is too stubborn or too scared to accept it." "Too scared." The words ignited 6 months of careful control. "You think I'm scared? I've faced down rustlers and men twice my size. Don't you talk to me about being scared." "Then what do you call it?" Her voice rose to match his. "What do you call a man who keeps the woman he claims to care for hidden away like something to be ashamed of?" The truth of her words was like salt in an open wound. She was right. He did keep her hidden. Not because he was ashamed of her, but because he was terrified. Real things could be lost. Real things could be taken away. And the fear of it made him cruel. "Maybe that's what you are," he snarled, hating himself as the words left his mouth. "Maybe you're exactly what a sensible man would be ashamed of. A woman who gives herself to a man without marriage, without promises." The slap was so fast he didn't see it coming. It cracked across the clearing like a rifle shot. They stared at each other, both shocked by the violence that had erupted between them. His cheek burned. "Don't you ever," she whispered, her voice shaking with a fury that was colder than ice. "Don't you ever speak to me that way again. I gave myself to you because I believed." She couldn't finish. The look in her eyes was one he'd seen before. In Missouri, in Texas, in Nebraska. It was the look of a woman who had finally seen him clearly and found him wanting. Iselin, I didn't mean... Yes, you did. Her voice was steady now, cold as the creek water in January. You meant every word, and maybe you're right. Maybe I have been fooling myself, thinking what we had was special instead of just convenient. She turned to go, and a raw panic seized him. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Everything was breaking apart. Where are you going? The question came out strangled, desperate. She paused, her back to him. Home, Kalan, back to my respectable life. The life I've been risking every Sunday for a man who thinks I'm something to be ashamed of. That's not what I meant. She turned back and her face was a mask of resigned finality that chilled him to the bone. The trouble is, Callan, I don't know what you mean anymore. I thought I did. But tonight you showed me how wrong I've been. She moved to her horse, her movements fluid and sure. Good night, Callan. Thank you for finally being honest about what I am to you. Iselin, wait. But she was already mounted, already disappearing into the darkness. He was left alone by the creek with the echo of her horse's hooves and the bitter taste of regret in his mouth. He told himself it was for the best, a clean break, better to end it now before things got more complicated. But as he mounted his own horse and turned for home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. In his desperate attempt to avoid the pain of being left, he had thrown away the one thing he couldn't bear to lose. He had lost her anyway, and it was all his own damn fault. The next morning, a bitter October chill had settled over the prairie. Callan tried to lose himself in his work, fighting a stubborn 3-year-old stallion in the round pen. The work was dangerous, demanding his full attention. By noon, both he and the horse were soaked in sweat, but the stallion had finally accepted the saddle. It was the kind of patient work that had built his reputation. He knew how to gentle a horse, how to earn its trust without breaking its spirit. It was a skill that had failed him completely with a brown-eyed woman who just wanted to be loved. He was rubbing down the stallion when Emsley rode up, his face grim. Afternoon, Cal. Heard you had some excitement Sunday night. Word traveled fast in Willow Creek, but how could anyone know? They'd been alone. Don't know what you mean, Callan said, keeping his eyes on the horse. Don't you? Emsley's voice was laced with concern. Mrs. Patterson said Miss Vaylor came home mighty upset, red-eyed and quiet. She even asked for Monday off from her teaching duties. Said she wasn't feeling well. The news was a kick to the chest. Isley never missed a day of school. For her to risk her position meant she was more than just upset. She was shattered. Maybe she's just sick, Callan said, but the word sounded weak. Maybe, Emsley said, not buying it. Of course, there's been other talk, too. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Seems Thomas Brum was in town this morning, buying supplies, and telling anyone who'd listen that he'd be calling on Miss Vaylor come Thursday evening, bringing flowers, and his intentions. The currycomb slipped from Callan's hand and fell to the dirt. Thomas Brum. He owned the second largest spread in the county. He was wealthy, established, respectable. Everything Callan wasn't. Good for him, Callan managed to say, his voice sounding distant. Miss Vaylor is free to entertain any caller she chooses. That she is, Emsley said, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Funny thing, though. Mrs. Patterson said Miss Vaylor seemed mighty surprised when the widow mentioned Brum's visit, almost like she didn't know he was coming. The implication was clear. Brum wasn't a man to make a social call without some encouragement, which meant either Iselin had been sending signals Callan hadn't seen, or something else was going on. Something wasn't right. Maybe she's been encouraging him at church, Callan said, but he knew it was a lie. Iselin was polite, never flirtatious. Or maybe, Emsley said quietly, word got around that a certain horsebreaker had a falling out with a certain schoolteacher, and an ambitious man saw an opportunity. The truth of it hit Callan like a punch to the gut. Of course Brum would move fast. Iselin was the perfect wife for a man like him, and now she was available. Don't matter to me what she does, Callan said, his hands moving with mechanical precision. Sure it don't, Emsley said. Just like you're free to stand there pretending your hands aren't shaking. Callan looked down. His friend was right. His hands were trembling. Maybe you ought to ride into town, Emsley suggested. Pay your own call before Brum gets there. And say what? Kalan's voice was harsh. Apologize for speaking the truth? Pretend I feel something I don't? Do you? The simple question hung in the air like a noose. Feel something you're pretending you don't? Callan couldn't answer. All he could see was the look on Isoline's face Sunday night, the way her eyes had died when he'd thrown his cruel words at her. It had been like driving a knife into his own heart. She wanted me to say I loved her, he said finally. The admission dragged out of him. And I told her she was asking for something I couldn't give. Emsley was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that would haunt Callan for the rest of the day. Was she? The question followed him through a sleepless night and into Tuesday morning. He found himself saddling his horse with no destination in mind, just a restless need to move. He told himself he was just going for supplies. But his horse took him the long way, past the schoolhouse. The children were outside for their noon recess. Through the open door, he could see Isoline at her desk, her head bent over her work. She looked smaller somehow, exhausted. As if she felt his eyes on her, she looked up. Their gazes locked across the dusty schoolyard. For a moment, the world stopped. Then a little girl, Maggie Patterson, ran to the fence. Mr. Vera, are you here to see Miss Veiler? She's been awful sad today. Another child piped up. She didn't even smile during arithmetic. And another, Emsley's own daughter. And she keeps looking out the window, like she's waiting for someone. Through the schoolhouse door, Callan could see Isoline standing now, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He saw the tension in her posture, a woman braced for another blow. He wanted to go to her, to explain, to tell her that Bram could offer her a fine house, but he would never know the way she bit her lip when she was thinking, or the sound of her laugh when she was truly happy. But he couldn't move. He was a coward, and she could see it. She called the children inside, her voice firm but trembling. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the empty yard. Then he settled his hat back on his head and mounted his horse. Good day, Miss Veiler, he called, his voice formal and stiff. Good day, Mr. Vera, she replied, her voice just as polite and just as empty. He rode away without looking back, but he could feel her eyes on him, watching him go. He felt like the smallest man in Kansas. Thursday morning arrived, cold and clear. Callan had spent the last day and a half trying to convince himself he didn't care that Thomas Brame was calling on Isoline. It was a lie. He paced his small cabin like a caged animal, calculating the hours until Brum would be sitting in the widow's parlor, charming Isoline with his money and his prospects. By 10 o'clock, he couldn't take it anymore. He rode for town with no plan other than to stop what he knew was about to happen. He tied his horse outside Patterson's mercantile, telling himself he just needed supplies. The store was busy, a normal Thursday morning. He nodded to a few acquaintances and headed for the back. That's when he heard it, Brum's voice, loud and confident. Finest woman in 3 counties, and that's the God's honest truth, Brum was boasting to a group of men near the stove. Smart as a whip, pretty as a picture, a woman of real quality. Callan froze, his hand halfway to a sack of oats. Of course it took some persuading, Bram continued, his voice carrying through the whole store. A woman like that doesn't just fall into a man's lap, but I've got advantages. A fine house. Good land. When's the wedding, Tom? Asked Doc Hartley. Soon as it can be arranged, Brum replied with a smug smile. Though between you and me, the lady's already shown herself to be receptive to my attentions. A few of the men chuckled knowingly. A dark, dangerous rage began to smolder in Callan's chest. Let's just say, Brum lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for everyone to hear. Miss Veiler has proven herself to be a woman of considerable experience. Not that I'm complaining, you understand. The crude laughter that followed was like a match to gunpowder. Every wall Callan had ever built around his emotions crumbled to dust. You lying bastard! The words came out low and deadly. The store went silent. Every eye turned to him. Brum's smile faltered for a second. I beg your pardon? You heard me, Callan said, stepping forward, his boots loud on the floorboards. You're a lying bastard, and you'll take back every word you just said about Miss Veiler. Brame's eyes narrowed. He was bigger than Callan, softer, but with a mean streak a mile wide. Strong words, he said calmly. Maybe you ought to mind your own business. You made it my business, Kalan's voice was ice. The minute you started running your mouth about a lady who's worth 10 of you. Brim's smile turned ugly. A lady? Is that what you call a woman who spreads her favors around like butter on bread? Because from what I hear, our precious school teacher ain't been too particular about whose bed she warms. The words hit Callan like a physical blow. Brum didn't just hear gossip. Someone had told him. Someone knew about their meetings. Where'd you hear that? Kalan's voice was a whisper, but it carried a menace that made men step back. A man hears things, Brum said, his confidence growing. Word is, she's been meeting some fella regular like. Out by the creek, where decent folks can't see. A real convenient arrangement. The blood roared in Callan's ears. Someone had been watching them, twisting what they had into something dirty. But I ain't one to judge, Brum continued, his voice dripping with false sincerity. A woman gets lonely, makes poor choices. I'm prepared to overlook her past indiscretions, seeing as how she's learned her lesson and chosen a more suitable companion. That was it. The casual dismissal of what he and Iseline had shared broke something inside him. All the fear, all the denial, it all burned away, leaving only a white-hot rage. He took another step forward. She never agreed to marry you, he snarled. She wouldn't give you the time of day. Is that so? Brum's smile widened. Then maybe you ought to ask her yourself. The challenge hung in the air. The crowd pressed closer. His friend Emsley had just entered the store and was pushing through the crowd, his face a mask of alarm. Cal, don't, Emsley started to say. But it was too late. Callan's voice rang out, clear and defiant, for all of Willow Creek to hear. Miss Iseline Weiler belongs to me, has for months, and any man who says different is calling me a liar. The silence in the store was absolute. Callan could hear his own heart pounding. He had done it. He had dragged their secret into the light. But as he looked at Brum's surprised face, he realized a terrible truth. Brum had been fishing. He hadn't known for sure about their meetings, not until Callan had just confirmed it for the whole town. Well, well, Bram said softly. So the horsebreaker's been sampling the schoolmarm's charms. That explains a few things. Explains what? Doc Hartley asked. Bram's smile was pure poison. Explains why she seemed so experienced, and why she was so eager to accept my proposal. Seems she's ready to trade up for a man who can offer her more than the stolen moments by a creek. The lie was so smooth, so perfect, that for a horrifying second, Callan almost believed it. Had he been wrong about her? Had she been playing him for a fool all along, just like Zeralda? You're lying, he said, but even to his own ears, it sounded more like a desperate hope than a statement of fact. Am I? Brum reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small object that made Callan's blood run cold. A blue ribbon, identical to the one he'd bought for Iseline. She gave me this herself, Brum said, dangling the ribbon from his fingers. Tuesday night, said she wanted me to have something to remember her by until we could be married. The crowd murmured. Assumptions were being made. Reputations were being destroyed. Callan stared at the bit of silk and felt something inside him die. It was happening again, just like before. He was the fool, the one left behind. All his old fears came rushing back, choking him. Face it, Vera, Brum said, his voice dripping with false pity. You were convenient, a way to pass the time until something better came along. And now it has. The words hit home because they were the very words he'd always feared. But then he remembered her face on Sunday, the genuine hurt in her eyes, the raw honesty of her anger. Had that all been an act? You're lying, he said again, his voice barely a whisper. Then prove it. Bram's challenge echoed through the store. Go ask her. Go ask your precious schoolmarm which man she's chosen. See what she tells you when you're looking her in the eye. Emsley was at his side now, pleading with him in a low voice to think, to not make things worse. But Callan was beyond reason. The months of denial, the years of old wounds, the burning rage, it all converged in this one moment. Fine, he said, his voice ringing with a terrible finality. Let's go ask her. The walk from the mercantile to the schoolhouse was like a funeral procession. Brum strode in the lead, confident and smug. Callan walked beside him, coiled tight as a rattlesnake. Behind them followed half the men in Willow Creek, a hungry mob scenting scandal. Emsley walked with them, his face grim, ready for the violence he knew was coming. The schoolhouse stood quiet in the sunlight, a picture of innocence. Through the window, Callan could see Iseline at the blackboard, pointing to letters, her students dutifully copying them down. She looked so normal, so right in that place. And he had just dragged her into the gutter with him. How could he have been so selfish, keeping a woman like her hidden away like a dirty secret? Having second thoughts? Brom murmured. No, Callan said, his voice hard as iron. Let's get this settled. Brum knocked on the door. They heard Iseline's voice pause, then tell the children she'd be right back. The door opened. She stood there in her simple teaching dress, her hair pinned back neatly. She looked from Brum to Callan to the crowd of men behind them. Fear flickered in her eyes, followed by a dawning horror. Gentlemen, she said, her voice strained, how may I help you? Miss Vaylor, Brum said with a flourish, we've come to settle a matter. There's been some confusion. Mr. Vera here seems to think he has some claim on your affections. The color drained from Iseline's face. She looked at Callan, her eyes wide with panic and betrayal. I don't understand. Don't you? Brum's smile was all sharp edges. Mr. Vera has been telling everyone that you belong to him. Made quite a scene. Iseline's hand flew to her throat. Emsley stepped forward. Miss Vaylor, maybe you should dismiss the children. This ain't for young ears. She nodded numbly and went back inside. They heard her tell the children they could go home early. A few minutes later, after the last child had disappeared, she stepped back outside and closed the door. She stood with her back against it, facing them all like a queen facing a firing squad. Now then, Brum said, perhaps you can clear this up. I've told Mr. Vera about our understanding, about the arrangement we made Tuesday night. Iseline looked at Callan, her eyes full of a new, sharp pain. You told them about us. I told them the truth. Callan's voice was rough. About what we've been doing. About what you mean to me. What I mean to you. Her voice was dangerously quiet. And what is that exactly? Because last Sunday, you made it very clear that I was nothing more than something to be ashamed of. Now see here, Brum interrupted smoothly. The question is simple. Miss Vaylor, have you or have you not agreed to become my wife? The silence stretched, tight as a wire. Iseline looked from Brum's smug face to Callan's desperate one, to the sea of curious onlookers. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and with the pride of a woman who had nothing left to lose, she spoke. No, she said quietly. I have not. Brum's smile flickered. I beg your pardon? I said no. Her voice was louder now, ringing with clarity. I have never agreed to marry you, Mr. Brum. I have never encouraged you, and I have certainly never given you any token of my affection. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the blue ribbon. Is this what you showed them? The ribbon you claimed I gave you? Brum's face began to darken. You came to my boarding house on Tuesday, uninvited. Mrs. Marsh told you I was indisposed. You insisted on leaving this. I never spoke to you. I never saw you. And I never accepted any proposal of marriage. The crowd stirred uneasily. The fun was souring. This was no longer a simple scandal. This was a man's honor being publicly shredded by a woman who was not backing down. Furthermore, she continued, her schoolteacher's voice cutting through the tension, you have spread lies about my character, and you have brought this mob to my workplace to humiliate me. It's the truth. Iseline's eyes blazed. And if you want to know about my private affairs, gentlemen, then yes. I have been meeting Mr. Vera. We have shared conversation and companionship, and yes, intimacy. And I am not ashamed of it. The admission hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Men shuffled their feet, suddenly uncomfortable. But she wasn't finished. She turned her burning gaze on Callan. What I am ashamed of, she said, her voice breaking just a little, is allowing myself to care for a man who was ashamed of me. A man who kept me hidden like a guilty secret, who called me something to be embarrassed by. The words were like stones, each one hitting Callan with brutal accuracy. The crowd was dead silent now, witnessing something far more real than they had bargained for. Celine, he started, his voice a choked whisper. Don't. She held up a hand. You've said enough. You've exposed us both. And for what? To prove a point to a liar? She looked around at the circle of faces, her own a mask of defiance and devastation. Yes, gentlemen, I loved Calanvera. I loved him enough to meet him in secret, to give him everything I had, to hope that one day he might find the courage to love me back. But love requires respect. It requires trust. She took a deep breath, her voice growing steady and cold. Whatever we had is finished. I will not be anyone's dirty secret, and I will not be with a man who thinks I'm something to hide. The finality in her voice was like a door slamming shut in his face. Something inside him finally broke open, spilling out all the fear and love he'd kept locked away. You don't understand, he said desperately. I never meant. You meant exactly what you said Sunday night. She cut him off, her voice like ice. I was convenient, and now I'm not. She turned her attention to Brum. And as for you, Mr. Bram, I would not marry you if you were the last man in Kansas. Your lies have shown me exactly what kind of man you are. Brum's face was flushed with rage. Now see here, I'm offering you respectability, a way to redeem yourself. I don't need redemption, Iseline shot back. And I certainly don't need it from a man who spreads gossip like manure on a field. My reputation can survive the truth, Mr. Brum. Can yours? The challenge hung in the air. The tide of public opinion had turned. The crowd started to drift away, muttering, embarrassed to have been part of Brum's ugly game. But Calon couldn't leave. Not like this. Iseline, please, he said, stepping forward as the last of the crowd dispersed. She paused at the schoolhouse door, but didn't turn around. Let me explain. She looked back over her shoulder, her eyes cold and distant. There's nothing to explain, Mr. Vera. You've made your feelings perfectly clear. No, I haven't. The words were torn out of him, raw and desperate. I haven't made anything clear because I'm a coward and a fool, and I was too scared to admit the truth, even to myself. She hesitated. The truth? He took off his hat, standing before her with his heart stripped bare. The truth is that I love you. I have loved you for months, but I was too damn stubborn and scared to admit it. I kept us a secret not because I was ashamed of you, but because I was terrified of losing you. Her expression softened, just a fraction. Scared of losing me? You're the one who pushed me away. Because every woman I've ever loved has left me for someone better. The confession burst out of him, years of pain finally given a voice. I thought if I didn't call it love, if I didn't make promises, then maybe this time, I wouldn't end up alone. So instead, she said, her voice full of a terrible sadness, you made sure we'd both end up alone. Instead, I made the biggest mistake of my life. His voice broke. I had everything I've ever wanted right in front of me, and I threw it all away because I was too much of a coward to fight for it. The silence between them was heavy with everything unsaid. Iseline leaned against the schoolhouse door, her breath coming in short gasps. You love me, she whispered, as if saying it too loud would make it untrue. He stepped closer, close enough to see the tears gathering in her eyes. I love you, he repeated, his voice stronger now, a vow spoken in the open air. I've loved you since that first night by the creek. I've loved you every Sunday, since even when I was too much of a fool to say it. But you said, Sunday night, you called me? I was wrong, he said. The simple admission was the hardest and easiest thing he'd ever done. I was scared. I was trying to push you away before you could leave me. I thought, if I didn't call it love, maybe this time would be different. So you decided to leave me instead. The hurt was still in her voice, but underneath it, a tiny flicker of hope. I decided to be the biggest fool in Kansas, he said, and I didn't even do that right, because here I am, standing in front of half the town, begging you to forgive me. Brum, who had been watching from a distance, finally exploded. This is ridiculous. The woman's nothing but a... Kellen turned, his voice going quiet and deadly. You're talking about the woman I'm going to marry. Choose your next words very carefully. The threat hung in the air. Brum looked around for support, but found none. He spat in the dirt and stalked away. Emsley stepped forward, a warm smile on his weathered face. "Miss Violer," he said, "I've watched my friend here for months. Watched him smile more, laugh easier. If that was your doing, you worked a miracle." Eastleen looked from Emsley to Callan, a look of dawning surprise on her face. "You talked about me?" "Never stopped," Emsley chuckled. "Drove me half crazy with stories about the school teacher who could gentle wild horses with a word." Callan's attention was only on Iselin. The world had narrowed to the space between them. "So," she said finally, her voice soft, "you want to marry me?" His throat was dry. "I want to marry you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and come home to you every night. I want to sit with you in church and dance with you at barn socials and never ever have to hide what you mean to me again." "And what do I mean to you?" The question held everything. "You're my heart," he said simply. "You're the part of me I didn't know was missing until I found you. You're everything good I never thought I deserved, and everything I want to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve." The tears she'd been holding back finally fell, but she was smiling through them. "Callan Vera," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you are the most infuriating, stubborn, wonderful man I have ever known." "Is that a yes?" She didn't answer with words. She stepped away from the door and into his arms. The kiss was not like the stolen moments by the creek. It was a promise, made in the bright afternoon sun for the whole world to see. From a distance, Emsley clapped slowly. "About damn time," he said. The news of their engagement spread through Willow Creek like a prairie fire. The scandal of their secret courtship was quickly replaced by the romance of Callan's public confession. 2 days later, the town preacher, Reverend Mallister, rode out to Callan's homestead. Callan's heart sank, fearing judgment. "Mr. Vera," the old preacher said, his eyes wise and kind, "I've been preaching in frontier towns for 30 years. I've seen every kind of love story, but I'll tell you something. A love that survives secrecy, scandal, and public humiliation is a love worth blessing." Relief washed over Callan. "But," the Reverend added sternly, "you will do this proper. Miss Violer is a respectable woman. You will call on her, ask the Widow Marsh for permission, and treat her with the dignity she has deserved from the very beginning." The next afternoon, Callan stood on the widow's front porch, scrubbed clean and nervous as a cat. In his pocket was a gold ring with a small diamond that had cost him nearly everything he had. Mrs. Marsh opened the door with a knowing smile. "I've come to ask your permission to court Miss Violer officially," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "A little late for that, don't you think?" she said, her eyes twinkling. "Yes, ma'am," he admitted, "but I'd like to start doing things right." He told her his intentions. He told her he couldn't offer Iselin wealth, but he could offer her his whole heart, a life where she would never doubt she was loved. "Good answer," the widow said, her stern face melting into a warm smile. "You have my permission, Mr. Vera, and my blessing." Iselin appeared in the doorway, looking nervous and radiant. He dropped to one knee right there on the braided rug. "Iselin Violer," he said, his voice shaking only a little, "will you marry me? Will you take me as I am, stubborn and scared, but yours for as long as I draw breath?" "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Callan Vera. Yes to all of it." The ring slid onto her finger as if it were always meant to be there. "No more secrets," he said, taking her hands in his. "No more secrets," she agreed. Their wedding took place on a crisp November morning. The whole town packed into the small church. Iselin, in a simple white dress with a blue ribbon woven in her hair, walked down the aisle looking like the bravest woman in the world. When Callan took her hand at the altar, his whole world finally settled into place. The reception was held in the same barn where it had all begun. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by their neighbors and friends, Callan knew he had finally stopped running. 3 years later, the Vera homestead was a proper ranch house, filled with the sounds of laughter. Their little girl, Clara, chased chickens in the yard, her face smeared with molasses. Another baby was on the way. Callan rode in one evening to find Iselin hanging laundry, humming a song from their wedding dance. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his hands on the gentle swell of her belly. Later, they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. Do you ever think about how different things might have been? Iselin asked softly. Every day, he admitted. But then I think about how it all worked out. Maybe we needed to go through all that fire to get here. Sometimes, he said, kissing the top of her head, a man needs to be stripped down to nothing before he can build himself back into someone worth having. And are you worth having, Kalanbera? She teased. He met her gaze, his heart full. I'm worth having because you made me worth having, he said simply, because you saw something in me worth fighting for, even when I couldn't see it myself. They sat in comfortable silence, a family forged in scandal and strengthened by a love that was no longer a secret. Love, it turned out, was worth every risk, and now that he had finally claimed it, he was never ever letting it go. What do you think? Was Calon right to be so afraid of love, or was he just a fool? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of a love that refused to be hidden, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the Old West.